We'll start today with the federal government's expected deficit spike. The Prime Minister has already signaled the size of the deficit will be, quote, substantial due to the economic impacts of our trade war with the U.S. But the interim parliamentary budget officer this week is sounding an alarm over just how substantial. Jason Jacques is projecting the Liberals will post an annual deficit of $68.5 billion this year, up from $51.7 billion last year, and that the federal debt-to-GDP ratio will increase over the medium term and remain above its pre-pandemic levels.
It's not a funny fiscal outlook. It's a really serious fiscal outlook. And we don't lightly use the word unsustainable, right? Unsustainable means you don't have the option of saying, maybe I'll wait a couple of years, I'll see how things go. It means if you don't change, this is done.
Joining me now for more is Jason Jacques. Hi, Mr. Jacques. Good to have you back here in studio. I appreciate you making the time.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
Our audience would just have heard a little snippet right now of what you told committee this week about the fiscal outlook that you presented. You said it's not a funny fiscal outlook. It's really serious. Why did you say that?
Well, this is in the report we clearly indicated that based upon the path we're currently on, by our estimates, it raises significant concerns with respect to the sustainability of federal finances.
What does that mean in layman's terms? I'm asking because we hear that word a lot from economists, particularly when we're talking about deficits or balanced budgets, you know, what and what isn't sustainable. When you say that you have concerns about the sustainability of our financial picture here in this country, like what in layman's terms does that mean?
I think certainly from our perspective, we're at the precipice. So we haven't gone over the precipice. We're kind of looking out over the cliff at this point. And we're at a point where, based upon our numbers, things cannot continue as they are. And I think everybody knows that, right? So what we've done is we've taken what everybody's feeling in terms of the anxiety across the country at this point, positive economic growth that doesn't necessarily feel very good. And we've actually put numbers around it with respect to the federal government's deficits over the next 5 years. And for us, it's really important to set the table for parliamentarians so they know what to expect, so they have a better sense of the overall context within which they're going to be presented with Budget 2025.
So what's at stake at the precipice? Like, if you fall over the cliff, what's there? If you're able to go the other way, what's there?
Obviously, you don't want to go over the precipice. That's probably...
Like, what happens, though, if you do?
Nothing good. And nothing good. And I think for parliamentarians, and certainly I think all Canadians are very much aware of the challenging economic times that we're in, and the fact that we're going to have more challenging times as we go forward, both in terms of trying to manage the deficit. So there isn't a lot of fiscal space the government has to actually work with at this point. But I think also more broadly looking at the restructuring of the Canadian economy. So something we've touched on as part of the committee hearings, and I think other people have highlighted, is this world order that we've had for the past 75 years is done. That both has geopolitical considerations around additional spending or increasing spending on the defense side, which is definitely a spending pressure. It also has immediate pressures in terms of the Canadian economy and definitely the attenuating or the diminishing of the linkages with the U.S. and our need to find other linkages outside the country. So in short, it means a lot of change within a relatively short period of time.
What does it mean for the near term or the more immediacy, though, as far as impacts on both the economy and what you're looking at, the fiscal outlook? And I ask because in response to some of your analysis, for example, the federal finance minister focused on, look, we're kind of in an emergency, I'm paraphrasing, but we're going to need to provide certain supports and ensure that our economy can withstand that. I sort of interpret that as, we will have to spend more than we would have liked to, let's say, because we have to address the imperative that this trade war with the United States has created and the sort of shock factor to our economy. How much wiggle room do they actually have to do that, in your view?
It is a very narrow path. It's a very narrow path, and it's going to require both consideration of shifting spending within the federal government, in addition to reducing spending or potentially cutting programs in some areas, as well as potentially some consideration around increases in revenues. in order to make sure that the Canadian economy, Canada, is actually able to navigate that very narrow path.
If I try to understand that in sort of layman's terms again, does that mean that, you know, essentially they can't just add those emergency measures? They're going to have to take something away.
In order to be sustainable and reduce certainly the anxiety we have in the office, and I think provide a certain amount of comfort both to other members of Parliament, other parliamentarians, Canadians writ large. There's going to have to be some sort of substantial change at this point. I think for myself, like I always think of it like the best analogy being, like you go into your doctor's office, you've had a bunch of tests in advance, your doctor sits you down and she says, yeah, well, there are a bunch of bad indicators on your blood and other bodily fluids, and if you continue everything you're doing right now, you're not going to end up in a good place and not where you want to be. So you need to make some lifestyle changes at this point. And for the federal government, potentially it's going on a bit of a diet in terms of some areas of spending. Potentially they want to bulk up on the defense side and expand those areas. And potentially they also want to consider, I don't know, taking on additional hours at the office so they can increase their revenues all at the same time.
Do you mean new taxes?
I guess we'll see. There are multiple options with respect to revenues.
Okay, I did want to ask, because one thing in particular when you're talking about sustainability that you flagged was your projections where debt to GDP are concerned. It's been, you know, there's lots of talk about what's a fiscal anchor, what isn't, all that kind of stuff. One of the ones that has consistently, I think, been identified by the previous government, and in some cases this one already, is the debt to GDP ratio. And often, you know, you flagged that going up over the medium term as a big concern. Often, you know, when I have interviewed, let's say, people in the government about it, the counter has been, and this happened during committee to a certain degree as well, you know, it's still not as bad as other countries. Like, relative to the positioning of other countries, that ratio in Canada is better. Does that matter?
I'm the Canadian Parliamentary Budget Officer, so from my perspective, I'm focused on the Canadian context and not actually being aware of what's going on in the other jurisdictions, but very much focused on the Canadian federal context. And having an increasing debt to GDP ratio over the next 5 years is considerable cause for concern. If for no other reason, as you point out, it has been probably, I would say, the most important mainstay anchor for federal budgetary targets like over the past 30 years. And certainly looking at the people that lend money to the country, it's one of the key indicators that they look at as well.
Why is that ratio important?
Well, because it represents two really important things that I think are really intuitive for people. The first is GDP, and that's the size of the economy. So how much stuff are we producing, how wealthy is the economy, and how wealthy are households? And the second is debt. So how much debt do we actually have to pay back? And I think for most people, like who run their own household budgets, you have a good sense of how much money you've taken in over the course of the year, and what are your payments on either your mortgage, your car loan, and other payments you need to make on a regular basis. And in a situation where the cost of actually servicing or potentially paying down your debt as a share of your overall income, if that's going up over time, it means that you need to make some tough choices regarding, okay, got to pay my mortgage, but potentially I'm not buying chicken this week, and I'm going to shift to something that's a little bit cheaper.
That's a good way of describing it. I just have one final question for you. And I know that your analysis included, I think it was up until August the 11th, the spending that had been announced, you know, new items, but there's some stuff that's happened, you know, since then, and I imagine in the budget there will be other, you know, spending initiatives announced. Plus, you've got a spending review underway, and we don't know what the conclusions of that will be. If you were to take a guess at this point about what the impact in the aggregate of that is on your projections, do you think that an even bigger deficit is possible?
It really does depend on what the government decides as part of the budget, because again, there end up being two key moving parts. Both on the spending side and on the revenue side. And I think at this point it kind of remains to be seen where they ultimately end up. But certainly something that we're focusing on. The short term is obviously important. We're also really keen to see where the government's targets are over the longer term, and potentially a recommitment to a declining debt to GDP ratio over time.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Mr. Jacques, a pleasure. Thank you for your analysis today.
Oh, Thanks for your interest.
Jason Jacques is the interim parliamentary budget officer. When we come back here on Question Period, U.S. President Donald Trump addressed the United Nations this week, decrying the institution itself and taking aim at member countries. How's the world reorienting around that new reality? Canada's outgoing ambassador to the UN, Bob Rae, is up next.